Okay, welcome back, everybody. So we finished in last class the 7 years that King David was the king in Hebron. And after 7 years, he decided to finally make the trek to Jerusalem and bring the ark to Jerusalem, finally. He knew that that was going to be the future spot. He was already told that that's where the temple is going to be built. So he thought now is the time. So after the ark, as we explained in last class, was in a town called Kiryat Ye'arim for 20 years, he finally went to Avinadav and retrieved the ark and made a whole celebration with thousands of people to go from Kiryat Ye'arim, maybe a 2-hour marathon to Jerusalem. What happened was, in his excitement, he asked different people to carry the ark on poles. Actually, it was not poles. It was actually on a wagon being led by animals. And this made Hashem, God, very upset, because even in the desert, it was the Levites that carried the ark. It wasn't being led on a wagon, being schlepped by animals. So in the midst of the marathon, the ark went and slid off the wagon, and Uzzah tried to grab it from slipping down to the floor, like a Torah being slipped and touching the floor. And he was struck and killed for this act of a regular Israelite trying to touch the ark. He realized, David, that this was a debacle, and they brought the ark to a house near Jerusalem, to the home of Oved Edom Hagiti. It was in those 3 months where the ark was in his house that a lot of blessings took place for him and his family. And 3 months later, David realized, let's try to do a second attempt. And this time he had the Levites carry it. This time he stopped every few feet and made sacrifices. And finally the ark made its home to Jerusalem, not in the actual temple, but still in a place called Giva. That's the town, little neighborhood by Jerusalem. And that's what happened there. You remember that David conquered a big portion in Jerusalem called Mitsudas David. Now it's called Mitsudas David. Then it was Mitsudas Zion, the Zion fortress. And with David conquering it, perhaps this is where the first time we see Zion, Zionists, or Zionism come to the world stage, with David conquering it. And we discussed the Philistines who made different and barked different things to David and the people, that they have no right to conquer it because our grandparents, Abimelech and Abraham, made a pact. But of course, David didn't listen because we know the Philistines already breached that pledge. So now they have Mitsudas Zion, this wonderful fortress, or now we'll call Mitsudas David. And the ark is now in Jerusalem in a place called Giva. And now he wants to build a temple. So Nathan, the prophet, told David, this is not for you, I'm sorry. There's too much bloodshed that you encountered in your life. But don't worry, it'll be your son. So I'm going to bless you that your son will indeed build a temple, but it's not going to be you. Okay, no problem. So David now has this mini palace, a castle, and it's here in chapter 11 of Samuel 2, where the whole story of Bathsheba takes place. And as we explained in many prior classes already, with David as a younger adult fighting the giant Goliath, that there was this individual, Goliath's assistant, Uriah, who helped David decapitate Goliath's head. And as a result, David promised Uriah, this non-Jew, that if he becomes a convert, he'll marry a Jewish woman. Who was this Jewish woman that Uriah ends up marrying? Bathsheba. This is what the Talmud tells us in Sanhedrin 107. So Hashem was a little bit upset with David for promising him a Jewish woman, because this Jewish woman was already predestined to marry somebody. Who was that person predestined to marry? David himself. So God told David, you thought you're going to have Uriah marry a Jewish woman. I'll have the Jewish woman who you were supposed to marry will marry Uriah, Goliath's assistant. So that's why later in life, when David had this attraction to Bathsheba, it wasn't just a physical romantic attraction that he had towards Bathsheba, but it was a subconscious soul attraction that David knew that Bathsheba really was for him. So that's what sort of caused David to lust after this woman, even though she was already a married woman to Uriah. So in the end, basically, David, to be able to marry her, has her husband Uriah go to the front lines, sends a note with Uriah to the general Yoav, and tells Yoav, send this guy Uriah to the front lines in your next battle. And when he dies, let me know about it, which is what happened. And then David has this, ends up marrying this woman, Bathsheba. But the truth of the matter is, according to most commentaries, David already had relations with Bathsheba even before he found out that Uriah was killed in battle. So when he ends up formally marrying Bathsheba, she's already a pregnant woman. So when she gives birth to a child, this infant dies a few weeks later. And it was Nathan that actually rebuked David and said, David, if a poor beggar came to a rich man's house for food, a person that had many, many cows, and this wealthy man says, why are you coming to me? And he tells the beggar, go next door. There's another person, he also has a cow, but that poor person only has one cow. And either wealthy person have dozens and dozens of cows. So Nathan tells David, what would you say if this poor man has to kill the cow to feed the beggar because of the mitzvah of giving charity and feeding the poor? So David says, that person should lose 4 times the amount. How can this wealthy man be so disgraceful? He should get punished 4 times. And Nathan says, but that's what you did. You have many, many wives and concubines. Uriah only had one woman, and yet you had him be killed so that you could marry Bathsheba. And David realized this terrible mistake that he did, and indeed he was punished 4 times like he said. So Nathan really didn't want to come out against the King David, so he rebuked him in way of the parable where David himself said, I messed up. And indeed he got punished 4 times, which we'll see soon. But the first punishment we see was with this baby, with this infant. And after the baby died, even though David was fasting and praying that the baby shouldn't die, but after the baby died, then he came to his wife Bathsheba and said, okay, we're done. Now we can be married and have a wonderful marriage and for a future marriage. And indeed, the next child that David had with Bathsheba, they called him Shlomo. He was going to bring peace to the world. And it was actually Nathan that told David, I want you to call this child Yedidia, the beloved of God, or God's beloved. Yedid, beloved, Yud-Hey, God's beloved, which really was a way to show David that his teshuvah, his repentance, was accepted. Otherwise, God would never allow for the second son, Shlomo, to be called Yedidia, the beloved, God's beloved. So basically, God is accepting David, Bathsheba, and his son, Shlomo. And indeed, many other people who were questioning David's purity, now with the prophet saying that the second child, this child should be called Yedidia, they realize that David's in good standing with God. Okay, moving right along. One of the people that David married, one of the wives that he married, was a woman by the name of Makkah. Makkah already had a husband. He either died or divorced, we're not sure. So David ends up marrying this widow or this divorcee, Makkah. From what I understood, it's a widow. This woman, Makkah, had a daughter by the name of Tamar. We see the name Tamar already in the Torah. At the end of Genesis with Yehuda, Tamar. So now we have another woman by the name of Tamar, who's basically now going to be David's stepdaughter, and his mother, Makkah. Some people say they were actually converts, and then David married them. But either way, David married this woman, Makkah. In addition to his other wives, he married Makkah and took in his daughter, Tamar. After they got married, David and Makkah had a son. His name was Avshalom or Avshalom. Okay. David, from one of his other wives, not Bathsheba, but from one of his other wives, had a son by the name of Amnon, Amnon, Amnon. This Amnon had an attraction towards his, call it half-sister. I mean, they're really no sisters at all, but he had an attraction to his sister, Tamar. So Amnon has an attraction to Tamar. Now remember, Tamar is just, I guess, a stepdaughter to David. So Amnon really has no relations to this person, to Tamar. I guess today we'll call it the half sibling. But halachically, they're allowed to marry because they don't share not the same mother, not the same father. So in any case, what did he do? This Amnon, because he wanted to get in front of this woman, Tamar. And you have to remember, in those days, even though there's one king and he has many wives and many children, they didn't sleep under the same roof. There were different castles, like different Airbnbs, different places, different acres, different farms. Each one had their own set of not slaves, servants, and so forth. So it wasn't so easy for even the children, the prince and the princesses, to be under the same roof. So Amnon had a friend. His name was Yonadav. And this Yonadav was a sly, tricky fellow. And he told Amnon, his friend, tell your father, King David, that you're sick. And it would make you feel better if your half-sister, Tamar, would come and visit. You haven't seen her in a while. And that's what happened. He played sick. David summoned Tamar to go and make nicey and bring breakfast and lunch. It actually says in the book of Samuel what kind of breakfast she made, waffles, pancakes, things like that. And instead of being a mensch and speaking nicely to her, he ends up violating her and doing immoral things to her. So Tamar's brother, Avshalom, got wind of this. So we're talking many years later after, of course, this marriage took place, because if you just do the math, you're talking maybe 20 years after the marriage of Makkah and David, because again, Avshalom thus was born. So we're talking many years later, Samuel Bayes jumps 20 years later, give or take. And this is when this whole situation happened, where Amnon violates Tamar. Avshalom is horrified what happened to his blood sister. So he decides to take revenge. And he wants to kill Amnon, who's a prince of David, his half-brother. But he's not a dummy. He doesn't do it right away. So he lays low. 2 years later, he makes a party in his house. Avshalom makes a party in his own house, a separate castle from the king. And he invites everybody, all the princesses, friends, everyone comes, besides David, of course, the king. And when Amnon comes to Avshalom's palace to party and hang out, Avshalom orders his servants at the strike of midnight to go and kill Amnon. And that's to take revenge of what he did to his sister Tamar. And that's what happened. So the commentaries tell us, so far we have in retribution or in punishment to what the consequence for what David did to Bathsheba. First, his infant child dies. The second punishment is that his daughter Tamar is violated. And the third consequence is that his son Amnon is killed by Avshalom. So those are three. And we'll see soon the fourth and final consequence to David is Avshalom himself will be killed by David's general Yoav. How did that come about? So before I get there, let's go back to this episode with Avshalom killing Amnon. So 2 years after this rape, Avshalom is quiet about it. 2 years, 1, 2. Then he does the kill of Amnon. So thus Avshalom goes into hiding for 3 years because he knows his father's going to want to punish him. So now you have 5 years. And after that, Yoav, King David's general, beseeches on behalf of Avshalom to let Avshalom come back to Jerusalem. The poor kid's in hiding. He screwed up. So after two years, so then after the 3 years of Avshalom in hiding, then Avshalom comes back into Jerusalem. but he's not able to see the King David. He's not able to go into the palace, because rather he's able to come to Jerusalem, to a palace, whatever, to his former palace. So now he hangs out in Jerusalem for 2 years, but he's not able to see the king. So you have now a total of 7 years. After the 7 years, then finally, David reconciles somewhat with his son Avshalom. Avshalom reconciles with David. During those 2 years when Avshalom was living in Jerusalem, being unable to see the king, he already starts to gather a lot of sympathy from a lot of people. David's getting older. Avshalom is becoming more handsome, stronger. He's also very wise, very smart. So he's starting to garner a lot of support. So finally, he tells, at the end of those 2 years, when he's finally able to see King David, he tells King David, I'd like to go home to Hebron, where our family began. And Avshalom does this with the advice of Achitophel. Achitophel was King David's advisor. He was a very smart man. And he also, the Talmud tells us he was also a relative of Bathsheba. And he was always upset what David did to his cousin Bathsheba. And he sort of got away with it. So Achitophel did this clandestine, move with Avshalom, and they went to Hebron. But before going to Hebron, Achitophel told Avshalom, ask your father, King David, if indeed you can go to Hebron, because you want to bring sacrifices there. Because remember, in those days, you're allowed to bring sacrifices everywhere and anywhere because the temple wasn't built yet. So David says, sure, I'll let you go home. Sure, go to Hebron, no problem. Do your sacrifices. He thought Avshalom was becoming a tzaddik, and he's changing his ways. And he's going with Achitophel, so he doesn't see the problem. And Achitophel told Avshalom, let's also get some priests, some Levites. And basically, he started to make like a miniature synagogue out there. He started to get people to pray, sacrifices. And before you knew it, he made himself a bit of an uprising where messengers went back to David in Jerusalem and said, Avshalom basically built himself up an entire camp and an army. And at that point, David realized the time has come where his own son is going to come out against him. So without any choice, David realized he better take some of his wives and some of his children and make a run for it. So here we have a great king, King David, they say in his 37th year of reign, which means if he died at 70 years old, he's 67 years old now, where he runs out, leaves Jerusalem, not from enemies, but from his own son, his own family. And he also heard that Achitophel jumped ship, his own advisor, went to Avshalom's side, so he was very scared and he went. David, in his humility, didn't scream, oh God, why are you doing this to me? He realized this is all part of the consequences that Nathan was referring to with the act that he did to Bathsheba. Now remember, David did this with good intent, what he did to kind of get Bathsheba and to marry Bathsheba. But at the end of the day, since David is held in such high regard, like Moses was held in such high regard, that's why just like Moses was punished and couldn't come to the land of Israel just by hitting the rock instead of speaking to the rock, so too David, who was held in such high regard, is getting all these punishments, including having to be on the run from his own son for some of the actions that he did years prior. Even though he did teshuvah, and even though his teshuvah was accepted, and his son is called God's beloved one. So this is what's happening. So now that he's on the run, David sends a spy. His name was Hushai Ha'arki. Hushai Ha'arki, who was his good friend, and he sends him to go back to Jerusalem to check up on his son Avshalom. At that point, Avshalom did something bad by the advice of Achitophel, which was he slept and basically raped David's 10 concubines that he left behind. He took his wives, but not the concubines. So you can see how mad this guy Avshalom is. In any case, Avshalom sees Hushai Ha'arki and he says, whoa, you're David's best friend, his confidant. Why are you here? This is how you treat a friend, by jumping ship? So Hushai says, no, whoever's the king, whoever God makes the king, that's who I'm with. That's where my allegiance lies. So Avshalom says, okay, we're going to make a quick chase. and we're going to go now after your boss, King David, and we're going to wipe him out because they're maybe just a few hundred people. Hushai tells Avshalom to slow him down. Why don't you wait and gather all the 12 tribes from all over Israel? Because everyone should have a stake in this victory of overthrowing King David, so that they will all now pledge their allegiance to the new king Avshalom. Hushai, of course, did this just to slow down Avshalom, so that he can send word back to David to get going. Achitophel, this very wise man, knows that David is very clever. He's good at running from the enemy. And Achitophel knew if Avshalom is going to wait to get all the 12 tribes, take a few weeks, David's already going to slip out of his fingers, and there's no way they're going to catch him. In any case, Avshalom decides to listen to Hushai and not to Achitophel. And he waits a few weeks to gather all the 12 tribes to make the onslaught and the move to kill David and his small, the militants, we'll call it. At that point, Achitophel realized once Avshalom stopped listening to him and he made this terrible move of allowing David to gather his troops, run away, Achitophel actually kills himself and hangs himself. Why? Because Achitophel knows that David for sure is going to come back to Jerusalem and he's going to be victorious. And that means Achitophel committed an act of treason. And in those days, when you commit an act of treason, not only are you killed and your possessions are confiscated, but the possessions of your children are going to be confiscated, which means your homes and your children's homes, and everything is confiscated because they belong to the family of someone that acted treasonous. So in order for Achitophel to avoid that and save his children and his children's possessions, he committed suicide before David would come back and claim the throne. That's what he did. In any case, it was a few weeks later that Avshalom gathered the troops of all the 12 tribes, and David divided his family and his soldiers into thirds, into 3 different sections. And to make a long story short, David tells Yoav, his general, and everybody else, you can catch Avshalom, but you can't kill him. Sure enough, Avshalom was riding on a horse. He has this long, beautiful hair. And as he's getting closer to David's camp, his hair gets caught and entangled by a thick branch of a tree. The horse continues to run, and Avshalom is caught hanging by his hair. Soldiers run to Yoav and say, Yoav, we caught Avshalom, he's hanging. Yoav says, did you kill him? So the soldiers say, no, of course not. David told us not to kill him. So Avshalom goes to so Yoav goes where Avshalom was hanging, and Yoav, the general, takes his sword and penetrates his chest 3 times. The Talmud tells us in Sota, this was for the 3 times, Mida connected Mida, measure for measure. Avshalom disrespected the monarchy, the Jewish people, and God. So Yoav penetrated his chest 3 times. But he didn't die then. He wasn't killed. So Yoav tells his soldiers, go ahead and I'll let you kill him. 10 soldiers took their dagger and each one thrust it 1 time into Avshalom's chest and he was killed. Again, Sota, the Talmud tells us why 10 times. Measure for measure, he went and raped David's 10 concubines, so he was killed with these 10 knives that penetrated his heart at the end. So I don't mean to be so gory, I'm just kind of relaying this. That's what I always say. I'm not sure why these books never went to mainstream Hollywood, because it's full of sex, drugs, rock and roll, and war and battle and things like that. Okay, so that basically ends the uprising of Avshalom and his people, because now Avshalom is dead. By the way, David goes into tremendous depression that his son was killed. That was the 4th consequence. So it was his baby, it was Tamar being raped, it was Amnon being killed, and Avshalom now being killed as well. As 4 different punishments, and now David himself knows it's done. Okay, David comes back to Jerusalem. There's some other interesting episodes that just time doesn't allow me to go through everything, but he comes back to Jerusalem and now there's a famine. He's not sure what's going on. The prophet Gad tells David, this famine is coming about because the Givonim, remember this thorn I was telling you about from the very beginning, when Joshua came to the land of Israel, there was these Gibeonites, and these Givonim told David, we want vengeance for the 7 Gibeonites that were killed many years prior because of you. So David says, what are you talking about? So they reminded David that Joshua allowed them, this is a non-Jewish tribe that pretended to be Jewish, pretended to live peacefully with the Jewish people, and then they pretended that they're going to convert. So Joshua told them, look, we're not going to, you're in question if you're Jewish or not, but either way, we'll for sure allow you to serve in the temple, to be the wood choppers, the water carriers, in the tabernacle, that is. And that's the way it was for hundreds of years, that those Gibeonite tribes lived amongst the Jewish people. It was questionable if they were Jewish or not, and that was it. But because they served in the tabernacle, so if you remember, when Saul was chasing David, when he wanted to kill David, where did David go in one of his runs? He ran to the tabernacle, which was in Nov, N-O-V, at that time. And there was a high priest of Yassa was there, and there was 82 priests were there, including 7 Gibeonites who were serving in the tabernacle because they were allowed to serve in the tabernacle. And when Saul heard that these priests and the high priest helped out David to get water and so forth, so we remembered, we learned earlier that Saul ordered the execution of the high priest and the priests and anybody else was there, which included the Gibeonites. We know, of course, it was Doeg Adomi, this horrible advisor that executed this mission. And it's now years later that now these Gibeonites are coming to David, who is now the king in Jerusalem, and saying, we want vengeance. It was because of you, because you went to this tabernacle to ask for food and drink, and they gave it to you, that it was a little bit later that Saul went and ordered the execution of everyone that was in the tabernacle at that time that helped you, King David. See, David wasn't sure didn't know what to do. So the prophet told David, if you want to stop the famine, you're going to have to kill 7 of your own, which meant 7 of Saul's descendants. I thought actually it was 7 children of David's concubines, but someone told me it wasn't his children, it was of descendants of Saul. Either way, these were 7 Jews from royal dynasty that David hung. And it was King David that said, now I know for sure these Gibeonites are not Jewish. We will excommunicate them, because people like this that have zero compassion and no mercy and are willing to kill 7 Jews, these people certainly cannot be Jewish. And it was from that point onwards that there was no question anymore about these Gibeonite tribes. They were no longer Jewish, but David still had to go ahead because the prophet told him, which means it's from the word of God, that he went and killed 7 princes of the Jewish people. Don't ask me how David did this. This is a horrible story. When I read this and I studied this, I don't understand how David can do this. But either he did this because he needed a famine to stop, thousands of Jews were dying, or he did this because maybe those 7 Jewish princesses deserved death. I'm not sure. It's very hard for me to wrap my head around this, but that is the story. And indeed, the famine stopped. There's a few more battles that took place. David, his general Yoav, won them all. And then at the very end of Samuel, because it's after the famine and after the wars and different things with the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Philistines, David tells his general Yoav, I want you now to take a census so we can see how many Jewish people we have left, just like Moses and Joshua did. They took a census of the Jewish people. However, there's a way to take a census. You can ask everyone to put $1 in the pot. So if you have $6 million, you know there are 6 million Jews. Or if you ask everyone to put a half a shekel in the pot, and then you count, let's say 1 million shekels, so you know there's 2 million people. But Yoav didn't take the census. He actually counted 1, 2, 3, 4. He counted people. And apparently this is not a good thing to do. Even till today in 2021, when we count people for a minyan, you say not 1, not 2, not 3. When you get to not 10, so now you know you have a minyan, but you don't count 1, 2, 3, 4. So David with Yoav, they took an improper census. And as a result, God, the prophet, a different prophet came to David and said, you're going to be punished for this. But I'll let you choose the punishment. It's going to be one of 3 options. Either there's going to be a famine, another famine. 2, there's going to be a war for 3 months. You're going to have to fight in battle. Or 3, there's going to be a pandemic. So David, in his humility, said, if I choose a war or a famine, who's going to be protected? My family, because my family has money. They have food in the storage houses. They don't have to fight in battle. And there's going to be favoritism if I choose those 2 consequences. So he says, I'm going to choose the pandemic because this way no one is safe from a pandemic. No one is safe from COVID-19. I don't care how wealthy you are or how rich or poor you are. COVID doesn't make a distinction. So indeed, there was a pandemic which was supposed to last for a few weeks. It ended up lasting for 1 hour. And Samuel 2 at the very end says 70,000 Jews were killed in this pandemic. It happened in 1 hour. It's supposed to last for a few weeks. It lasted 1 hour. Okay, so that ends it. Now there's just a few verses left at the end of the book of Samuel. Now the end of the book of Samuel was not written by Samuel. We call it Samuel because he anointed Saul and David and everything else. But it was actually God and Nathan that actually finished writing the book of Samuel because they're the ones that are living at this time. So this is the holy book, the end of Samuel 2. Now what happens? There's something very interesting, and this is the first time we really see Jerusalem on the map. What happened was, David, who's living now in Jerusalem, he sees this Satan with a sword who is basically killing everybody. We know even with COVID, it's not COVID. We believe in God, and God's behind everything, even bad things, seemingly to us bad things, clearly, because people are dying. But either way, God's behind it. We don't say when there's bad things, God's not around. Only when there's good things, we don't say that. God's around in everything, fortunately or unfortunately. So behind this pandemic was the Satan. Anyone that's dying is not dying because COVID says so, it's because the Satan says so, because the Malach HaMavet, the angel of death, says so. So this angel of death, or we call it the Satan, is holding the sword and he's wiping, killing people out. He finally now comes to a town or a place called Arna, A-R-N-A-H, in Jerusalem, with the sword in his hand, and he's ready to go crazy. He's ready to start killing, wiping people out. And this is when David is pleading with God, enough's enough. And he basically, it's like the story of Marvel, where the Satan is 50 feet high up in the air with a sword in his hand, dripping with blood, and he's just ready to slice and dice. And finally, God is listening to David and says, okay, Satan, Malach HaMavet, angel of death, enough's enough, you're out of here. David's prayer was welcome and is being fulfilled, and no more, the pandemic has to stop. So the Satan takes his knife, his sword, and he wipes it on the cloak of David. It was from that point onward, David actually got very sick and very cold, and nothing was able to make him warm again. We'll see in the next book of Melachim, of Kings, where it discusses the death of King David, where he's lying on his deathbed and nothing can make him warm. But why was that? Because of this episode that happened with this angel of death taking his sword and wiping it on the cloak of David. Why did this happen? Why did David deserve something like this from the angel of death? Because you remember that a few years prior, before David was king, he took his sword and cut the corner of King Saul's cloak. When King Saul was on the chase trying to kill David, David confronted him in hiding in a dark cave and cut the corner of his cloak. And it was from there that King Saul knew that the end was there and that King David would be the next king. How? Because King Saul was told by Samuel the prophet himself that the person that cuts the corner of your cloak know that he will be victorious and he will be the next king. And that's what David did. Now, even though David was within his right to do what he did, because Saul was trying to kill him, but at the end of the day, King Saul was an anointed king by God himself, by Samuel. So who gives David the right to do something like this, to cut the corner of his cloak? So again, we're talking about subtleties, because David is such a tzaddik, he's being haunted and he's being fingered, being pointed at for a sin which is so minuscule to our eyes, but for David, the tzaddik, he was not supposed to or shouldn't, or at least he's going to get punished for doing something like this, of cutting the corner of Saul's cloak, the corner of the cloak. And thus was at the end of David's life, where this angel of death took that sword and cut the corner of David's cloak. This whole place happened, like I told you, in a place called Arna. There was a non-Jewish individual hiding in his house, watching this exchange happen between the angel of death and David. And his children were literally hiding behind the window. So when this exchange finished between the angel of death and David, David goes with his soldiers into the home of this guy, Arna, and says, I'd like to buy your house. I'd like to buy the animals. I'd like to bring a sacrifice here, because this is where the pandemic stopped and this is where the angel of death was removed. So the guy says, no, David, anything you want. I'll provide the animals. I'll pay for it. And I'll even give you my house, but I'm not going to sell it. This is like a major miracle what I just witnessed. And David says, no. I'm going to buy the house. I'm going to buy the animals because I want to bring sacrifices right here where this exchange happened between me and the angel of death. And that's what happened. He actually bought the house. He brought animals. The commentators say, Rashi brings down as well, that they dug underneath the house and they saw there an altar, a mizbeach, that Adam brought thousands of years prior. He did a sacrifice. And this location that is being brought down at the very end of Samuel, I believe chapter 27, is the spot of Mount Moriah where Isaac was almost sacrificed by his father Abraham. This was the place where Adam brought the sacrifice. And this is the center of Temple Mount where King David was told this is where the future Beit HaMikdash is going to be built, not by you, but by your son, Shlomo HaMelech. And that's how Samuel 2 finishes, with King David being reinstated as king, although a very weak and elderly king. And it ends with the spot in Jerusalem where David purchased with his own money the house, and he has now possession of the altar, bringing sacrifice for thanks to God. And that's how it ends. And this is really, from what I see, the first time, besides David capturing this Mitsuda, this fortress, but this is where we see for the first time the actual location of Temple Mount. Thinking about modern day politics, remember this story, because people will say, yeah, Joshua went to the land of Israel, but he went to Shiloh, went to Gilgal. Where does Jerusalem come into the picture? It's this episode of where the pandemic stopped, where David purchased this plot of land from a non-Jew by the name of Arna, who wanted to give it for free to David, but David bought it. And again, Nathan and God recorded this at the very end, the last verses of Samuel 2. So that ends our class. Thanks everybody for listening, and God bless.